Over the last year or so, a brand of mouthpieces that has truly exploded in popularity and really catapulted into the public eye, at least to my understanding, is Lotus mouthpieces. Lotus is a company formed by Adam Rappa. You may be familiar with that name. He's an incredible player and an equally incredible salesperson. Take that positively or negatively as you would like. I grew up watching demonstrations by Adam Rappa of Monet equipment, and then later he splintered off from Monet, stopped working with them, and eventually developed his own line of products. His mouthpieces have really taken off in the last couple of years, and I want to talk about some of them today and describe my experiences with them and what you can expect if you go down that route yourself. Welcome back to Mouthpiece Spotlight. How's it going, everybody? It's your host, Sam, here from the Samuel Plays Brass channel, once again coming at you with another episode of Mouthpiece Spotlight, and a long overdue one at that. I hope you're all doing well, and I appreciate you all tuning in today. I've been meaning to talk about Lotus mouthpieces on the channel for quite a while now. I haven't personally been able to go to a dealer or a distributor in the area. There aren't any near me, unfortunately, so I haven't been able to go through the whole process of trying everything out and getting fitted for my perfect Lotus mouthpiece. But nonetheless, for the past year or so, I've been scouring online, finding whatever fun secondhand deals I can for sizes that are within my ballpark, and learning what I can from that. That's not what I recommend for most people. I don't mean for this to sound like the trite, this is a trained professional at work, don't try this at home type warning, because obviously it's your discretion what you do with the money in your wallet. But nonetheless, I strongly recommend that you actually go and get fitted for Lotus mouthpieces rather than just buying random ones. I've done a lot of research on mouthpieces and how they're made and how the specs interact with each other and how that translates to your playing experience. And you can go to that video if you want to learn more about it. It'll be up in the card for your perusal. But nonetheless, this is not something that a lot of people are necessarily able to do without extensive research beforehand. Today we're going to be looking at 3 different Lotus mouthpieces, all Gen 2, meaning they're all at this point discontinued, but have Gen 3 equivalents that should more or less be the same mouthpiece, just plated with their special industry secret gold compound. And these 3 mouthpieces are all fairly close to the types of sizes I use generally, which is to say, fairly large and deep. Today's mouthpieces are the 1L in brass, 1XL2 in nickel silver, and 1XL in bronze. Let's talk about each of those specs and what they mean in context. Particularly if you play on Bach mouthpieces, Lotus sizing is fairly intuitive. First things first, the number refers to the inner diameter or the perceived chop width of the mouthpiece. It's how much of your chops actually fits into the cup. Starting with the number 1, you're on the large end of the scale, down to the number 11. On the small end of the scale. And a lot of these numbers translate fairly closely to Bach numbers. For instance, Lotus 1s are indeed quite similar to Bach 1s, although it's a little bit one size fits all in terms of the Lotus 1 encompassing mouthpieces from the Bach 1, 1 1/4, and 1 1/2 families. And that's not ideal, but that's nonetheless Lotus's approach, considering that in many cases, depending on the exact era of manufacture, Bach 1 1/2s and 1s and 1 1/4s actually tend to be fairly close together in size. That's not always the case, so that is indeed a gripe of mine with Lotus, but nonetheless, that's their approach. Then from there you have 2s, 3s, 7s, and 9s. Why they couldn't have just gone the odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, and 11, and had the same number of numerical sizes is beyond me, particularly when you consider that a Lotus 2 is about a Bach 3 and a Lotus 3 is about a Bach 5. Now, Lotus's cup naming convention is, in my opinion, one of their most ingenious features. It's a very simple scale that works very effectively. You have a scale for cups that is similar to that of t-shirts. You have on the large end of the scale your extra large, your double extra large, down to your extra small, and it makes perfect sense. The largest sizes are double XL, XL, things like that, and you go all the way down to your XS or your XS2. The 2 thing is a little bit interesting. Those are sort of fractional sizes in between cups. So you have your extra large, large, medium, small, extra small, and in between each of those you have a 2 counterpart, which is just a little bit tighter and higher compression than its non-2 equivalent. For instance, an L2 is a little bit more of a fiery, high compression L, and an S2 would be a slightly even tighter S cup. Now, as far as the cups we're looking at today, we'll start off with the 1L. L is Lotus's standard middle-of-the-road orchestral C cup, as Adam Rappa describes it. He strongly advises that anybody trying out Lotus mouthpieces starts on their preferred inner diameter with an L cup. And then from there they can explore whether they want to go deeper or shallower, etc. But nonetheless, while it is considered an orchestral C cup, it's not exactly the same as all of Bach's C cups, which vary widely based on the number attached to them. For instance, if you play on a 2C or a 7C, chances are you're used to a substantially deeper cup than someone playing on the shallower end of C cups, like the 3C or the 8C. And then there are ones that land in the middle, like the 1¼ C, the 5C, the 6C. But what's worth noting is that the Lotus L cup is very much a standardized middle-of-the-road depth that should stay the same for all numbers of L cup. Next in line, we have the XL2, which as mentioned is a little bit shallower than the XL, the 2 meaning slightly shallower than, and in fact it doesn't end up being much deeper than the L. It's around the same depth as some of Bach's deeper C cups, for instance, like I said, the 1C, 2C, 7C, those types of cups. But then we have, without the 2, the size XL, and that is squarely a Bach B cup. It is quite a bit deeper than most of Bach's C cups, and it ends up being not only deeper, but a tiny bit more V-shaped as well. You have a little bit more of a reaching towards the throat rather than a bowl that ends squarely before it. And there's one more feature of Lotus mouthpieces that I want to touch on that might seem small, but is actually fairly significant from a design perspective. Regardless of generation or size or whatever else have you, all Lotus mouthpieces clock in a little bit shorter in terms of just total overall blank length than basically anything on the mainstream market from brands like Bach, Yamaha, Shew, etc. Most modern trumpet mouthpieces clock in at about 3½ inches in total length, and Lotus mouthpieces are all a little bit shorter than that. And I think the best way to explain this is actually Dave Monet's school of thought. Monet noticed a couple of things in his early design work. He noticed that a lot of players, himself included, were struggling with a naturally sharp lower register and a naturally flat high register unless the player strained to push it back up, which would reduce the sound output up there. This is what he and many others refer to as octave compression. First things first, Monet notes that modern 3½ inch trumpet blanks are supposedly too long for their instruments, and so he has different lengths of mouthpieces for each key of trumpet: B flat, C, D, E flat, piccolo A, piccolo B flat, and each of those is getting a little bit shorter progressively, but even his B flat mouthpieces are shorter than 3½ inches. He believes that the 3½ inch mouthpiece is best suited for the key of low A, which is not a key that you typically see trumpets manufactured in these days. So like I said, even his B flat mouthpieces are not quite 3½ inches in length, and I think Adam may have borrowed from that. Now, something really cool that Lotus lets you do that I wish more brands took advantage of is the ability to order your mouthpiece in one of 3 different base metals. That is to say, the metal stock that it's actually machined from before being plated, whatever the plating material happens to be. First things first, we have the industry standard, which is of course just make the mouthpiece out of brass as you would the trumpet, and that gives you all the standard trumpet tonal qualities you would come to expect from that size of cup. And furthermore, after the cup size, there is no extra nomenclature to specify it's made out of brass, so if it doesn't have an extra letter after the cup size, yeah, it's a brass mouthpiece. But then we have a couple other metals. First things first, we have bronze, which is pretty cool. That's a little bit of a darker metal. It'll be notated B after the cup size, and it tends to provide a little bit of extra roundness and fluffiness to your sound as opposed to brass, especially at the softer dynamics, without really rounding off too many of the high frequencies. I think it just brings up the low and middle frequencies, especially when you play loudly. I think bronze still does project really well, but nonetheless people regard it as being a little bit darker. And then you have nickel silver, which is a brighter and zippier sort of metal. While it's not super distinguishable from brass at lower dynamics, once you really step on the gas, it lights up, it really boosts the high end of your sound, and it just gives you a little bit more centered, focused nature to your sound. So that's good for correcting a sound that lacks definition. And that is notated by an N after the cup size. And what you may have noticed, something that I think is cool about those different materials, is that none of them are too innately different from brass across the whole dynamic spectrum. Brass has that sort of middle-of-the-road tone at all dynamics, and nickel sounds a lot like brass at the softer dynamics, but really brightens at the loud dynamics, whereas bronze does sound a lot like brass up at the top of the dynamic range, but starts to sound really different and have some of its greatest benefits at the lower end of the dynamic spectrum. And so you can have basically the same mouthpiece with the same cup specs for loud playing, middle of the road playing, and soft playing with very different tonal results. Pretty interesting. Now, of course, in an ideal world, I would want the exact same cup in all 3 metals to be able to test, but unfortunately, like I said, I don't have access to unlimited Lotus mouthpieces. I've just been scrounging around online for whatever I can find. And so unfortunately, we end up with 3 different cups out of different metals, but nonetheless we cover each of the different metals, and moreover we cover 3 popular deeper mouthpiece sizes, and I think that's pretty cool. So let's talk about some of their popular size equivalents. The 1L is pretty much just a Bach 1¼ C, Shew 18, Yamaha 17 C4 type deal. Really nothing too different from that. The 1XL2 nickel is similar to a Bach 1C, a Yamaha 18C4, a CL229, those kinds of mouthpieces, but as a result of being made from nickel, it does have a little bit more zing and focus, I find, than any of those mainstream options. And then the 1XL made from bronze is pretty similar to something like a Bach 1B or a CL220 D2D. I don't think Yamaha has a great equivalent for it, but I think it actually has more core, more color, and a little bit more fluffiness at the soft dynamics than either the Bach or the CL2. Now, it's been a big fat minute since I've done one of these announcements, so for anybody who's new here or still on the fence, I'd like to reintroduce you to my Patreon page, patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass, link in the description or in the top right corner in the card. I am a one-man enterprise trying to juggle content creation along with going to college, going to work, going to outside music stuff, and other stuff going on in life. So even as little as a few bucks a month on Patreon goes a long way in securing bigger and better content on the channel. The Samuel Plays Brass meta is constantly evolving. I'm constantly coming up with bigger and better ideas, but they are tough to execute. So if you would consider going to patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass, it would really lighten the load on my shoulders if you considered pledging. There are lots of perks for different amounts of money on the channel, from early access to credit at the end of my videos to exclusive content on the channel, lots of stuff like gig vlogs and extended explanations and extended commentary. So once again, patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. And let's now return to your regularly scheduled programming. And what we're going to do now is going to be a little bit different than previous Mouthpiece spotlights I've done. I'm going to showcase one excerpt at a time, and after each, I'm going to provide some commentary on those three mouthpieces and how they perform. Make sure you've got headphones for this part. You're going to need them to catch some of the subtleties at play. On the softer end of the dynamic spectrum, I would say the sound progresses pretty linearly with cup depth, where the deeper you go, the softer and more diffuse the sound gets. Like I mentioned, nickel doesn't really get angry until you cross about a mezzo forte, and I really didn't do that much in the Shew, so I think all three of these sound about in keeping with what you would expect for that respective depth of cup, from a 1 1/4 C to a slightly deeper 1C to a 1B. It all kind of makes sense. I personally found low slurs a little bit easier on the deeper cups, but all three I think honestly offer pretty good consistency on slurs and phrasing throughout the full register. Now, being the very dogmatic cornet player that I am, it'd be unfair of me to expect any of these three trumpet mouthpieces to sound like a cornet when plugged into a trumpet, but nonetheless, I thought I would test a cornet excerpt on each, just to observe some of the subtleties and the way they behave when I approach them the way I would a cornet and proper cornet mouthpiece. Now, the 1L, as expected, was the most consistent across the dynamics, and furthermore, in my opinion, its cup is just too shallow to really properly imitate cornet inflection. I wasn't quite getting the slur patterns or the blow that I wanted out of that mouthpiece, whereas the 1XL in bronze was actually fairly close. I was impressed. It is overall just a whopper. I mean, Bach 1B is nothing to scoff at, and I don't personally like the 1B, so the fact that I find the 1XL fairly comfortable for what it's worth is quite a miracle. But nonetheless, I find it just a little bit strenuous, so if I'm doing a lot of high dexterity cornet work, I don't know that the 1XL would be my choice on trumpet. But the 1XL2 in nickel is very compelling. I had some interesting results with it, and I think in general there's a lot of merit, if you're a deep cup user, to getting quite a deep cup on a nickel blank. What that does for you is it gives you the blow and the general slotting patterns of a deep cup, and it generally gives you that deep sound that you get out of a deep cup, but then you have the opportunity to really put some spin on the tone if you, once again, gas up your air. That opening lick especially, I think, really came out crystal clear on the nickel blank, and I honestly like how it kind of softened up for the next passage. I do think that deep cup and nickel blank is a really good combination for that sort of traditional cornet literature where you're getting a big mix of loud and soft and high and low and everything in between. To be honest with you, I went in with pretty high expectations for the Lotuses on C trumpet because of their shorter blanks and what that might do for octave control, and consequently those expectations had to be tempered because none of these three are my optimum for C trumpet, as it turns out. The 1L was pretty uniform and fairly uninteresting, if I may, across the range and dynamics, whereas the 1XL2, despite being a little bit deeper, since it was made from nickel, it did actually give me a little bit easier zing on the top notes and a lot more of a sort of dynamic tonal compass, if you will, where it sounded a certain way in the middle register and then I'd kind of gas up my air for the high notes and it would really soar in a way that the brass 1L did not. Then the 1XLB, it was just a little bit unfocused and exhausting to play on. It's a really cool sort of tone quality for C trumpet when you combine it with a large bore C trumpet, but again, first things first, way too little impedance for me, and second of all, it's better for things like soft playing, like the Mahler 3 post-horn solo, or particularly for playing second trumpet. When you're playing really high or solo or exposed stuff, I don't know if I'd recommend going quite that deep. Some people can make it work, but even me as someone who prefers deeper cups, not quite. What I typically use for my lead playing, even if it's not quite as shallow as the typical lead cup, is a GR67M with commercial backbore, and so to that end, none of the three Lotuses are lead mouthpieces in the truest sense of the word. They've all got, big fat honking orchestral cups on them, and none of them really have the optimal backbore geometry for extended, really bright high register playing, but nonetheless, they all held their own fairly well, I would say. They allow a lot of wind power from the player, and they don't really crack or break up too much. They've all got a really solid sound above the staff, and they can all brighten up regardless of the metal they're made out of or how deep they are. I think they all really have a lot of color in their sound up there. And so as a result, none of them I would say are the worst lead mouthpiece out there. I mean, you wouldn't take a Bach 1B in most cases to your lead gigs, but the Lotus 1XL could be worse. Now, as I mentioned, Lotus blanks are a little bit shorter than most mainstream brands. Even a lot of the lead makers like GR or Bob Reeves have longer blanks at like 3.5 inches. Whereas the Lotus blanks being a little bit shorter, I do think works in their favor, particularly if you prefer to use a deeper cup for lead playing. None of these were too bad in the upper register pitch-wise. None of them required too much correction, in my opinion. I think most brands with cups that deep, you'd be doing a lot more corrective work. The 1L was honestly about as close to perfect as I think you can hope for from that large of a cup in the upper register. High Ds on first valve and high C sharps on 1 and 2 were sitting perfectly happy where they're supposed to and not really demanding any pitch correction from me, whereas on some mouthpieces I'm genuinely used to having to let go of that first valve for high D just to get that pitch propped up, particularly if it's a deeper cup. The 1XL2 was really close in my opinion. There wasn't too much going on. I think in general the pitch center sits a little bit lower than the 1L, so I push my tuning slide a little bit, and then it's fine. The 1XL, it is starting to get a tiny bit flat in certain areas, but if you brought a Bach 1B to your lead gig and you tried to play lead on it, you'd be straining on anything probably above about a high A to get the pitch up, and the Lotus does, I think, a little bit better in that regard. Pretty much irrespective of the piece of trumpet equipment that you hand me, but particularly deeper cup mouthpieces, are things that I love to test ballads on. Ballads are the exact kind of place you'd use a deeper cup, right? And indeed, as expected, the 1L and the 1XL2, even being made of nickel, had a nice amount of tasteful fluffiness to the tone, but definitely nothing on the 1XLB. The bronze blank and that XL cup, that is exactly where they excel. Those two things work together to really create a beautiful, fluffy, Chet-like tone quality, even if Chet did not play size 1s by any means. You do have to work a little bit harder, in my opinion, to rein the sound in with that big 1 diameter, and so the blow on all of these is a little bit different than I would expect from, let's say, my Bach 1.5 type mouthpieces in the softer dynamics, and a little bit harder to control as a result, but all three of them were able to play really softly, especially, once again, the XL. And of course I wouldn't be a trumpet player if I didn't senselessly and tastelessly and carelessly pound out double Gs on every single trumpet mouthpiece you hand me. And as it happens, even for the fact that they have deeper cups, all three of these have really good slots up to double G, I would say. I didn't really test any higher. It was not particularly a high register day for me today. But nonetheless, up to double G, all three were great. All three have really good low registers as well, which is nice. I think the XL cup overall offers me the cleanest slurs as somebody who plays on Bach A and B cups all the time. But on the other hand, the L and XL2 cups, I think, allow me to ascend a little bit easier without kind of having to mentally shift for the upper register. I try not to actually move the mouthpiece or take it off and change what I'm doing when I go up, but there definitely is a mental and sort of air-oriented shift that takes place on deeper cups. So where does all this waffling lead us? I've tested these mouthpieces over the last several months, numerous times individually and together against each other. I've taken, at the very least, the XL2 and the XL to gigs. Are these mouthpieces magic? No. That's not what you should be looking for from any mouthpiece. And moreover, when I tried these mouthpieces, I wasn't particularly looking for anything new or for anything that I wanted to change. and so I didn't find anything new from them. I think they are really, really good mouthpieces, and I've had quite positive experiences with at least those two that I'm sure I've tested on gigs. In both cases, I was really impressed with what they could handle and what I threw at them and how they were able to perform even when I was really riding on the skin of my teeth and did not have a lot of endurance. It was really incredible, honestly, what they managed to do. I think they are more competent in some areas than your typical mainstream mouthpiece, but of course the price tag reflects that, and so you have to take that with a grain of salt. I think these are all great mouthpieces, but I find it unlikely that I would switch full-time to any one of the three. They are just more tools in the toolbox, and they're not really my daily drivers. And that just goes to show you that, again, I wasn't really looking for anything new. I was just looking to try things out and see how it stacked up to my current options. And honestly, whatever diatribes Adam Rappa might spew about Bach mouthpieces, my Bachs are absolutely my favorite. They're very near and dear to my heart. They have a certain sound and blow to them that I just can't replace, no matter how many other stupid mouthpieces I buy and collect and try and allow to accumulate on my rack. Now, this is of course not magic, it's metallurgy, but I do really like what Lotus is doing with those different base metal blanks. I think their brass mouthpieces sound like every other brass mouthpiece in the industry, which is to say, kind of boring. Whereas the other two metals, the bronze and the nickel silver, have some really interesting dynamic sort of aspects to them. In situations where I don't want to play on a shallow cut, but I really do want to be able to cut from time to time without necessarily having the nasal quality that shallow cups give me, a nickel blank is indeed really, really helpful for me. The bronze blank is less helpful to me and more just fun in the sense that I love to play with the darkest, stupidest, fluffiest sort of sound that I can, not necessarily for any virtue of good tone in that setting, just because I like to play dark when I can. Now let's round this discussion off by talking about how you can get the most out of your Lotus experience, because frankly the way I do it is not advisable for most people. Seriously, don't just buy stuff willy-nilly. Go and try it if you can. I don't mean to, once again, sound like I'm saying, oh, I'm a trained professional and you can't do what I do, you're not going to get good results out of it. But A, I've done my research, and B, I've had my fair share of field experience at this point, so there are certain things I've come to expect, there are certain things that I know exactly how it's going to work before I even try it out, and I don't think it's fair to assume that most players have that level of technical knowledge because of the hours and hours that I've put into that. So seriously, go try. Don't just buy if you can help it. With that being said, don't just try it blindly. Go in with specific goals. I mentioned that I wasn't looking for a change from my current setup, and so the point of a Lotus was kind of moot at that point. I wasn't going to find something revolutionary in a particular Lotus size. I was just seeing how it stacked up to things like my Bach 1.5A, which I am still very loyally and stubbornly glued to, if you will. Let's talk about two case studies here. Here's case study number one. I play a Bach 5C, let's say, and I want a little bit more zip and control in the upper register, and I find that my endurance up there is a little bit lacking, so I want something with just a little bit more support without the tone getting too nasal. So I jimmy on over to my local Lotus dealer, let's say that I have one in this case, and I, first of all, just play my Bach 5C on my trumpet, and I see what that feels like for the start of the day. Then I try the closest Lotus equivalent in brass. So in that case, that's probably a 3L. I'm going to try a Lotus 3L in brass and see what that does compared to my Bach 5C. If that's not quite what I'm looking for, not enough brightness, maybe I either try a 3L2 in brass or I try a 3L in nickel. And that's what starts to inform my decision. If the L2 feels a little bit stuffy or shallow or nasal, then I favor maybe the 3L in nickel. If I'm finding that the 3L2 is more what I like, but it's still not bright enough even with the extra support, I might try a 3M or a 3L2 in nickel, and you see how this sort of iterative process ends up working. Let's say in case study number 2, I play a Bach 3C, and I am instead looking to sort of round off the edge in my tone without it being harder to play. So once again, I go over to a local dealer, and I put my Bach 3C into my trumpet, and I play it like I normally do, and I go, okay, yeah, that's about what I expect. Then I try, let's say, a Lotus 2L2 in brass, which should be very close to that 3C, and if that is my jam, and I like it the way it is, sure, maybe I leave it there, but maybe instead I explore what a 2L sounds like, which despite being the equivalent of a C cup, is substantially deeper than a 3C, because 3Cs ride shallow in most cases, and so I see what that 2L has to offer in brass. Maybe I try one in bronze, maybe I try the L2 in bronze, and once again, it's the same sort of iterative process where maybe you change the cup a tiny bit, maybe you change the material to closer to what you're looking for tone-wise. You might honestly prefer the exact sound that you have right now, but different playing characteristics, and so you might stick with brass and not waste your time with other metals. But that is the sort of process that I think you should go through if you're looking for a new mouthpiece with different playing characteristics when you go to try Lotuses out. And lastly, give yourself time to acclimate. I can't do that given my playing schedule and all of the different mouthpieces and horns that I try out, but if you're the type of player who isn't running a YouTube channel for this thing and doesn't have this insane quantity of mouthpieces to get around to reviewing, yeah, I would say only use that new Lotus mouthpiece for a couple of weeks, take it to all of your playing, warm up on it, cool down on it, and everything in between on it, and then after a couple of weeks, go back to your old mouthpiece and see what's changed. Do you still feel better going back to your old mouthpiece? If so, the Lotus is probably not a good move. If you play your old mouthpiece and you're like, whoa, that doesn't feel quite right, you may have just acclimated to the Lotus and it may be the right fit for you. I don't get the opportunity to do that, unfortunately, just because of the way things run around here, so that's not my experience. Now, unless I'm much mistaken, this is about to be one of my longest videos of all time, so I think I'd better round it off here before I tire myself out with any more waffling. But nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed that episode of Mouthpiece Spotlight. I've really enjoyed putting these 3 mouthpieces through their paces. They now are with my private teacher who is trying them out, but nonetheless, I hope to get all of them back and do further testing. If you did enjoy this video and you're still sticking around, much appreciated by the way, make sure to leave a like and a comment down below, and stay tuned for more Mouthpiece Spotlights coming soon. Until next time, I'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.